Okay, let me get my headsets on. We're going to have a very interesting podcast today. So, start out with a little information that I just came across that I will definitely need to do a separate podcast and potentially an article about this morning because there's basically nothing on television. And the my husband likes to watch CNBC in the morning to do his, day trading. As y'all log on, can you give me a sound check, please? I just wanna make sure everything's, um, working properly. Um, so anyway, he had a program on that was talking about Y2K because, of course, the millennium and the scare of the computer issue and that type of thing. One of the newscasters talking about Y2K happened to mention that 1999 was the year Putin and I think it's Meglovich, um, basically, he stepped down and, Putin was like the vice, and he stepped in for him as president, and, not Meglovich, hold on, let me pull this up. Um, anyway, Putin becomes president of Russia, and what's interesting about that is now that we have new eyes and we look at everything in light of how it relates to Operation Gladio, I wanna share a couple of things. Can y'all give me a sound check and make sure you can hear me? Um, that I found very interesting. One of the very first things Putin and I don't know if it's been in one of the books that, we've read yet on Gladio, because 'cause I've read a whole bunch we haven't reviewed yet. Chechenian rebels, as they were called, are Gladio, uh, entities. They were trained and equipped to by other intel agencies like the CIA and MI6 and Mossad in order to be a thorn in Russia's side whenever they needed it. So, one of the very first things that, um, Putin did was go after them, which I found very interesting. Also, he spent about 8 years 6 years in East Germany while he was in the KGB. What's interesting about that is in the research that we've done into Gladio, we know that both in Ukraine and in East Germany, Galen, who set up Gladio with Alan Dulles, left stay-behind units in both Ukraine and East Germany. The problem that they had is the majority of them, once the Soviet Union took over those territories, is they figured out who they were and wiped them out. So, there's no doubt that Putin knew all about Operation Gladio. He knew all about the stay behind unit, and would have known who's behind the Chechenian rebels as well. There's also a whole bunch of other, interesting tidbits about Putin actually taking Russia through what Argentina is gonna have to go through right now with there being austere conditions because of the corruption, and it was Putin that sought to end that corruption, and I've touched on this several times about how the West, the international syndicate, was working with corrupt oligarchs in Russia to steal Russian resources, and one of those entities was called the Hermitage, which is where we found the Browards and where the Magnitsky guy came into play that he ended up getting killed because he was the one that was facilitating and kind of the point guy in Russia. What we were told about the whole, Magnitsky, Broward, that's all basically a lie. I read Broward's book, all a lie. They were basically doing what they do every time, uh, in what we've learned to be a typical Gladio takeover. They I think they honestly thought Putin was one of them, and because of his ties to the Intel network and everything else, and he proved almost like JFK, see them at all, and then became untouchable because of his security and a major thorn in their side, which would explain everything that we're seeing today. The Chechenian rebels staged all kind of terrorist activities in Moscow during the time that Putin was trying to crack down on the oligarchs. All of this plays exactly into high casualties, focus on women and children, what we've learned to, um, recognize as Gladio operators. And also, if you look at him coming in the end of '99, first part of 2000, we roll right into 2001, which is September 11th, which creates all kinds of, um, chaos and gives Bush Senior an excuse to pull out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty as if that's going to be a threat to Putin. And Putin stood with German and France to object to the invasion of Iraq. There there's just so many consistencies in what we found with the Gladio that it definitely, um, warrants further investigation. We'll just leave it at that. So, with that, we're gonna get into our book, and hopefully y'all can hear me. No one's gonna give me a sound check yet. We left off talking about United Brands and the United Jewish Appeal as it relates to, uh, Lex Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein and Max Fisher and that whole Todman, Henry Ford II. So, I wanna review just a little bit so we can pick up. United Brands, as we know, was a focus on the part we covered with Guatemala in that it's a CIA front company. It eventually turns into United Fruit, and Max Fisher and Alfred Taubman are all directors on this company, basically meaning they're part of the CIA, and United Brands owned 42% of the land in Guatemala. They use basically slave labor, and the transportation or logistics, thank you. The transportation and logistics aspect of owning a company in a place like Guatemala where they're staging rebel forces and training them, which they were, gives you access to all of that in the case of United Brands, all of that territory. 42% of the country was under the ownership of this, and they paid 0 taxes to Guatemala. They owned almost half of the country and didn't allow the country to make any profit off of that land. And the first president that they elected that tried to kick them out got assassinated. So, welcome to Gladio. So, you have Lex Wexner, you have Max Fisher, you have Albert Tudman, all a part of this organization that has this presence in Guatemala. Like I said, the logistics going back and forth with aircraft and shipping under the guise of taking fruit in and out of the United States provides the exact same cover that we found in Sicily going through Cuba in when they put heroin in plastic oranges and shipped them as quote unquote fruit into New York for distribution throughout the United States. So, same kind of setup. It United Brands was represented by Sullivan and Cromwell, which is where the Dulles brothers worked. Sullivan and Cromwell is a part of the you could not have the international syndicate that I speak often of without Sullivan and Cromwell. Not that they wouldn't be replaced by someone else, but they were integral from as far back as before World War II in representing the international syndicate members, as well as all of the CIA front companies. You also have Peter Grace, which is W.R. Grace's son, and he inherited W.R. Grace. These people are also connected to AmeriCare and Covenant House, which was a pedophile operation, and also the majority of these people I just mentioned are all Knights of Malta. You have Samuel Zemurray, who helped smuggle arms to Zionist paramilitary organizations after World War II. We've talked about that in other podcasts. These were the people that were, um, setting up what is the current state of Israel before it was the current state of Israel. And by paramilitary, they're talking about Gladio operations. Max Fisher, became the chairman of United Brands, and Eli Black, who is a corporate raider, took control of the company in 1968. Eli Black also was I'm gonna say he was murdered. He fell to his death from the 44th floor of the Pan Am Building in Manhattan. He was supposedly under a great, uh, amount of stress based on corporate raiding, and, of course, his death was ruled a suicide. Black's son, Leon, would become a corporate raider just like his dad. He founded Apollo Global Management and became a close associate of Jeffrey Epstein. So, in '78, Max Fisher steps down from United Brands, and Seymour Milstein takes over, but Max Fisher stays on the board of directors. During that time, a group consisting of Fisher, Todman, Henry Ford II, Charles and Herbert Allen of Allen and Company, which comes into play on a lot of these deals. Several other industrialists, real estate groups, and businessmen took control over Irvine Ranch in Orange County. Some of the other people were Howard Margulies, Marguleas, who sat on the board of United Brands as well, and they kinda got into a bidding contest with Mobil Oil, but they end up with the ranch, and Todman is quoted as saying, "The first person I called was Max Fisher, my dear friend from Detroit, whose financial resources were matched by his extraordinary business judgment, along with Henry Ford II and Howard Margulis." So keep in mind that Max Fisher is the guy that basically owns Detroit. He's the top of the tip-toppity rich people in Detroit, and he's the one that pulled the scam on getting his picture taken with all of these, prominent Black Detroit residents saying that he was gonna renovate downtown Detroit, and then basically used all of that goodwill to build very ritzy, exclusive residential towers that none of the Black people could afford. So he basically takes advantage of people. So, Todman and Allen first met in the 1950s. They were introduced by a guy, Vincent Peters, who was the vice president of a New York City brokerage firm called Cushman& and Wakefield. They joined forces with real estate tycoon Arthur Robloff to launch a real estate venture called Bayside Properties, and this was to create a whole bunch of West Coast shopping centers. So the Allen brothers maintained all of the connections to organized crime and intel agencies in Freeport, and we have also Arthur Robloff as an investor in an entity called Grand Bahama Development Company, DevCo, that was formed by Meyer Lansky's front person, Louis Chesler. So, what Whitney's doing in an expert way is showing you that all of these people that surround Jeffrey Epstein all have mob ties. They all do the money laundering real estate ventures. It's as if this entire entity that they're setting up has every aspect of a self-contained money laundering, the weapons trafficking. They're all, uh uh, acquaintances, if not business partners, with Adin Sh Khashoggi, who is the most notorious at this time that this is all going on, weapons dealer in the entire world. Allen helps arrange Chesler's ouster at Devco, which saw him replaced by a guy by the name of Max Orovich. Orovich was also close to Lansky, the mobster, and we've talked about him a little bit before. He's the one that had Major Realty, which is another real estate investment, which was used to money launder the syndicate. She calls it the syndicate. It's the money laundering that was created from drug trafficking, which we all know to, be Operation Gladio. And Major Realty has come up in some of our other Gladio books as being one of the real estate vehicles used to do that. So, Major Realty also dealt with a guy by the name of Edward DeBartolo, who is also connected to the organized crime syndicate. So in '83, you have Fisher, Todman, Henry Ford II, and they all sell their stake in Irvine Company out in California, and they use that money to go after, Slotsby's, Sotheby, the big, auction house that's famous in London, and the Todman Group say they're gonna save Slotsby's, along with a group of investors that included and Getty, and the Getty is the California Gettys that Nancy Pelosi and Gavin Newsom is tied to, Milton Petrie, and Les Wexner. They paid $139,000,000 for the auction house, $70,000,000 which was loaned to the group by Chase Manhattan Bank. Isn't that nice? So there were rumors, but no proof, that Queen Elizabeth II actually got involved and put in a good word, um, for these guys to buy it, because it's an icon in London. And also keep in mind that art, i.e. auction houses, is another perfect place, as we found out with Hunter Biden, to launder money. So just keep that in mind. Todman's original group of investors to take over Slotsby's did not include Wexner, but had instead included Max Fisher, Henry Ford II, and a man named David Murdoch. These men were part of the central group. Murdoch was notably one of the largest shareholders in Occidental Petroleum, led by Murdoch's closest friend, Armand Hammer. And we know from our previous studies, Armand Hammer is a communist. He literally was named after the hand sign and the hammer. His dad was an ardent communist. So at the time of the deal, Murdoch's investments were managed by a guy by the name of Herbert, nicknamed Pug, Winokur, Winokur. He had previously been involved with the Penn Central, which we talked about. They basically owned Penn Central, sucked all the money out of it, and it collapsed, which they do a lot. Winokur was involved in launching a joint venture between Dave Murdoch's Pacific Holdings Corporation and Peter Kwiwet, Kiewet, and Sons, which was called Kwiet Murdoch Investment Corporation, KMIC. The purpose of this venture was to acquire the Continental Group when Ken Lay, best known for the Enron CEO that totally ran Enron into the ground, which I think, based on what we know now, Enron was another money laundering outfit that they suck all the money out of. Murdoch's teams up with Peter Kywek and Sons is significant as the corporation was identified as one of the main components that poured millions into Franklin Credit Union, which is the guy that was running the pedophile into the White House, Larry King. Kywet chairman Walter Scott Jr. also was on the board of First Tier Bank in Nebraska, which provided cover for the Franklin Credit Union's overdrafts. So Franklin Credit Union, ran by Larry King, would overdraw their overall credit union balance sheet, and this bank that this Kywet guy owned covered their shortfalls for them and also loaned them millions and millions of dollars. All the time, Larry King was running the pedophile network. Wondering what he got out of all that. So, I did kind of a little diagram, and what's interesting is it's almost like a circular where you go from the KMI Continental Group, of which Ken Lay is part of, to this Walter Scott Jr., to the First Tier Bank, to the Franklin Credit. So, basically, they're all in bed together, maybe literally. So, Ark Burnett, Bernet, is the parent company of Slothby's, which officially became controlled by Tubman, and Tubman was described as the White Knight of the auction house. Within 4 years, the auction house was booming, and the takeover was seen as a success. Part of this was because Tubman had a practice of offering customers financing for up to half of the most conservative estimate of the value of the art. In other words, he's floating loans. In other words, he's money laundering. And until 1994, um, this was the guy that was running this whole entity was called Michael Ainsley, Ainslie. In '94, he became the director of Lehman Brothers. Oh, another bank that went bankrupt for all of the same kinda shady practices in 2008. They're like parasites. They go from one entity to another entity to another entity. They suck all the resources out, God knows where, in massive money laundering activity, and the shell that's left collapses, and we get stuck paying the bill, as we did with Lehman Brothers. In the late '80s, there was, let's see, the Slossbys saw a boom. The modern art, primarily impressionist art and modern art, had a market of over $1.1 billion just in New York and London alone. At the end of the decade afterwards, it had risen to outrageous amounts of money. Todman's larger business empire, um, had been he had been, suspected of business methods that were questionable. In 2000, government prosecutors began investigating, and in '95, Schloss they determined that Slossby's had conspired with its rival auction house, Christie's, to split the business, um, in auction houses and fix commissions. In other words, collusion. And Sir Anthony Tenet, Tennant, the former chairman of Christie's, turned up in fake books and appointments scheduled with Todman as if those dates were the dates they were missing to collude on the price fixing. So the chief executive officer, Diana Brooks, was investigated by the FBI and subsequently prosecuted for this price fixing. Christie quickly confessed and acknowledged their role in it, basically turning the tables on Todman and gonna be leaving him holding the bag because he didn't get the deal. Todman ended up serving time in the Federal Medical Center of Rochester, Minnesota, and he was prohibited from conducting business from prison. Diana Brooks was found guilty for her own admission and sentenced to 3 years of probation, including 6 months of house arrest. Because stealing money is not that big of a deal. One of those So Todman's lawyer presented dozens of letters written by all kinds of people saying what a great guy he was. Of course, one of those was written by Les Wexner. Leading up to Tubman's arrest, Ghislaine Maxwell was a regular visitor at both Slosby's and Christie's auction house. She basically spent a lot of time at these auction houses and would use them to recruit girls for Jeffrey Epstein at the auction house. Maxwell engaged in these activities on behalf of Epstein's, while Wexner was on the board at Slosby's. And while Tudman controlled the auction house. Her role in recruiting what they referred to as gallerinas for going to the galleries. In 1984, Fisher relinquished his remaining United Brands stock by selling it to Carl Lindner Jr. He was a Cincinnati businessman behind American Financial Corporation. These shares, along with Seymour Milstein, who was the guy that took over, allowed Lindner to take control of United Brands in 1984. United Brands is now called Chiquita Brands International. And just so that y'all know, that's where the words Banana Republic came from. The situation in Guatemala, where they're known for banana production, was called a Banana Republic for the destruction wrought there by the CIA. It's kinda sick when you think about it. And I might add, everybody that's calling the United States a banana republic now has only to thank the CIA again. A month later, if you look in Oliver North's notebook after this February 1984, change of leadership, United Brands had issued a grant to the National Defense Council Foundation, founded and ran by a National Security Council staffer, which works for the president, and low intensity warfare expert by the name of F. Andrew Messing, Messing, for the study of Mexican political center. Messing was also involved in the Iran-Contra affair. And you remember us talking about John Singlaub, Singlaub. He worked closely with Messing. Singlaub's company, Geomilitech, which we talked about in chapter 7, was involved in the whole Iran-Contra as well. The National Defense Council Foundation also employed J. Herbert Humphreys, a a Memphis businessman and financier of Civil Materiel Assistance, which was a paramilitary unit deployed to Honduras to aid the Contras. So again, this is talking about Operation Gladio entities working in Honduras. Out of a National Defense Council foundation, and for those of you who haven't been with us the whole Gladio, trail, the National Defense Council had money set aside through this foundation to do similar things that the CIA does that the CIA doesn't wanna do. Obviously, this is one of them. Carl Lindner Jr. is found in Norse Notebook in March of 1984. A second reference is, talking about a meeting they're gonna hold at the Ocean Reef Club. This is a Florida hangout where Lindner was also often found. Ocean Reef played a role in cocaine smuggling activities of Jack Raymond DeVoe, which was talked about in a 1985 news report. Quote, "The cocaine was taken to the Bahamas in large planes. The cocaine was hidden inside the wings of smaller planes that landed in South Florida airports to clear customs. The cocaine unloaded at the posh Ocean Reef Resort in Key Largo totaled more than 15,000 pounds, according to state indictments." Unquote. Now, we also heard about the Ocean Reef Resort when we were doing our original tracking of the Gladio drug network that was laundering money through the Vatican, and when they were transferring all of the cocaine processing from the Corsican mafia that Richard Nixon wiped out down to the CIA-controlled mafia in Sicily. When they lost Cuba, the Bahamas became the new staging point. That's where Paul Helliwell set up the Bank Castle Bank that was to facilitate the excessively successful money laundering because the money laundering got so big, they had to create a lot of extra banks. That's how we ended up with the BCCI in Pakistan to be a major source of money laundering capability. They did a lot of other things too. But the BCC Bank became the 7th largest bank in the world with branches everywhere because they did so much money laundering for this network. So and of course, she goes on to say, to mention what I just was talking about, that the proceeds of this money laundering was used at Castle Bank and Trust, and that it was set up by Paul Helliwell. So I'm getting ahead of myself. Fisher developed a cozy relationship with President Reagan, continuing the traditional advising of Republican presidents that he had done for many years, and his specialty was Middle East and Jewish matters. In 1980, he, along with Todman, how do you pronounce it, organized a fundraising dinner for Reagan. During the Reagan years, Fisher also became a member of the board of overseers of the B'nai B'rith International. And by the way, most of these Jewish people are members of the B'nai B'rith, which is a secret society of Jewish people. And I've talked to a couple of my Jewish friends about that organization and really had my eyes opened about what it is. So, also, a part of the B'nai B'rith International was Edgar Brockman and Edmund Safra. And remember, Safra is the guy that got involved in basically trying to steal all the crack from Russia and money laundering, weapons trafficking, and he's the guy that burned alive in his house. They nixed him. And he ran the Republic National Bank in Switzerland that was doing a lot of the money laundering as well. So all of these people, um, and also Safra's bank was connected to BCCI. All of these people are members of the B'nai B'rith International. In the 80s, Fisher was instrumental in covert immigration to Israel. I don't know what covert immigration is, but operations that brought thousands oh, here we go. Operations that brought thousands of Ethiopian Jews to Israel, that was not part of the official immigration program of Israel. It was called Operation Moses in 1984, Later, Operation Solomon in 1991, Fisher and Gordon Sachs, who, like Fisher, was a ardent Zionist businessman and advisors to US presidents. So, that's one of the things that came up in the conversation. Is Benaiah Bareth just another name for Zionist? I don't know the answer to that, but it does seem to have almost 100% overlap there based on the research that my friend had done. Okay. So Fisher, Max Fisher, and Gordon Sachs, um, also provided, um, covers probably not the right word, but encouraged the CIA to hook up with Mossad on multiple different operations. George H.W. Bush, who counted on both Sachs and Fisher as advisors, was involved in Operation Moses while serving as the US Vice President. So he's aiding illegal immigration. Shocker. Um, in the 1970s, Fisher had spent time with Louis Pincus, Pincus, who comes up a lot, and he was part of the Jewish Agency, which had been the operative branch of the World Zionist Organization and had played a major role in founding and developing the State of Israel. Its role in smuggling arms to the Zionist paramilitaries in Palestine after World War II was detailed in Chapter 3. And just so that y'all know, that also, when we were talking about it in Chapter 3, had to do with basically Gladio-like units, paramilitary, that were funded, and illegal weapons were trafficked to them to create havoc in Palestine, both prior to the creation of Israel and afterwards. And the targets of that chaos was all religions. They just wanted chaos there. When it was relaunched, this Zionist organization by Fisher and Pincus, its leadership was divided among the World Zionist Organization, the United Jewish Appeal, and the United Israel Appeal. So you have the United Jewish Appeal, the United Israel Appeal, and the World Zionist Organization. Louis Pincus was first managing director of El Al Airlines, which is Israeli's major airline. El Al Airlines has also notoriously been used to conduct covert operations, including Operation Moses. They just disguise them as regular transportation flights. Leaked cables from the South African intelligence in 2015 basically confirmed this. South Africans intel believe that Israel used El Al as a cover for its intelligence agencies. That was a quote. Quote, Israeli intelligence agencies posed as El Al employees, unquote. Quote, security operations at the airport were, let's see, that were illegal under South African law, unquote. So basically, they're going into other countries as posing as airline employees, but are really Mossad. After Pincus' death in 1973, Fisher would the Pincus Fund in his memory, largely financed by the Israeli government and the Jewish Agency. Wexner's father-in-law, Yehuda Koppel, like the reporter Koppel, after starting his career in the British-led Jewish Brigade and transitioning into a leadership role in the Haganah, which did a lot of terrorist activities, or it was a paramilitary organization, opened the first US office of El Al Airlines, expanding the front company's presence in the United States. Livia, Livia Chernoff, the mother of Michael Chernoff, who was the first head of the Department of Homeland Security, was a flight attendant for El Al and participated in Mossad operations like Operation Magic Carpet. Isn't that interesting? So Michael Chernoff's mom basically worked for Mossad, and he was in charge of implementing the post 9/11 Homeland Security. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. So, Carbide 911, Carbine, Carbyne 911. Michael Chernoff became involved in that company, which was funded by both Epstein and Israeli Prime Minister Ignat Barak, whose leadership of Carbine 911 was almost exclusively Israeli intelligence veterans and current assets of Mossad. Can't make this shit up. Jewish agency member Fisher would also hold major leadership roles in the United Jewish Appeal as well as the United Israel Appeal. I didn't do any digging into those 2 things. I'm not sure exactly what the difference is. If anybody has done any research into them, please send it to me. I will definitely, get it out there, and we'll talk about it because I do think it's interesting that these 2 entities I did a paper on, Zionism. These 2 organizations do keep coming up, and I had forgot when I did the Zionist paper that they were in this book. Organizations would play a major role, those 2 organizations, in Fisher's protege, Les Wexner's activities in the 1980s. One of the largest individual contributors to the United Steel in America in 1986 was Wexner. The United Jewish Appeal has since merged with United Israel Appeal and was headed by Fisher's daughter, Jane Sherman. In '87, Wexner had also became the vice chairman of the United Jewish Appeal and the eventual creator of the Wexner Foundation's Heritage Program. And the reason why I wanted to come back to this is because this is very, very important, this Heritage Program. Also, part of this Heritage Program was Rabbi Herbert Friedman, who also had served as the CEO of the United Jewish Appeal. So, obviously, all of these people are on all of these committees, and like we have discovered with all of them, like the when we were talking about the fascists and them having the dinner clubs, the monthly dinners, supper clubs in London, these organizations just provide them an opportunity to look like they're doing good and meet all the time so they can do things that are not all that good for the rest of us. By March of 1985, a lawyer in Columbus, Ohio, by the name of Arthur Shapiro had been murdered at point blank range in broad daylight. He had been eating breakfast in his car when an unidentified man who was in his car with him, um, basically, Shapiro gets out of his car and starts running. The man fired his handgun and grazed Shapiro's hip and arm before he reached a condominium and began pounding on the door. The man comes up behind him and shoots him twice and then leaves and goes away. He takes Shapiro's car, which is found the next morning in a mall parking lot, which is interesting because remember who owns all of the malls? Les Wexner. It was deemed by the police to be a professional hit, which of course in our minds we immediately think, Operation Gladio because they're the ones that controls all of the mafia hits. So, local authorities suspected Shapiro's murderer had been hired by a Columbus-based accountant, Barry Kessler. Two of Kessler's employees from that period alleged that they had seen a man matching the killer's description visit Keller's office and saw Keller counting out large piles of money before the man arrived. Since the killer's description is based on clothes alone, it would it would mean that the killer came to receive what is presumed to be payment for a contract killing. It is also not clear how long after the murder these former employees of Kessler relayed this information to the newspaper. Kessler when Kessler was arrested for an unrelated contract killing after so this all came out after Kessler was arrested for another contract killing after the FBI got involved. In '91, Kessler was charged in Florida for arranging the killing of his business partner, John DeRoo, DEROO. He was convicted of that crime in '94 and died in prison in 2005. Kessler was caught in the DeRoo case through the use of an FBI informant. Kessler had been tricked by the government informant into complicity in a criminal act. That's what Kessler's attorney said. Informant let's see, the Columbus Dispatch is quoted as saying, "Informant led way in Florida arrest." It was only when Kessler was charged in connection with the DeRoe slaying in '93 that he became the prime suspect in the Shapiro case. So, knowing what we know now, this could have all been a setup to blame somebody else for a crime somebody else did, right? Because that's how the FBI works in some cases. So, if they wanna pin the murder on someone else, they use a FBI trap down here in Florida to convict the guy, and because he was a player of some sort there, the implied allegation is, "Hey, he did it down here, although he was entrapped into doing it. He probably did it up here so that the real killer goes completely free." I'm not saying that's what happened. That's a possibility that we now have to consider based on what we know about how they operate. Kessler was never charged with the Shapiro murder, and the Shapiro murder was never solved. Kessler had been convicted along with 2 co-conspirators of helping Arthur Shapiro, the guy that died, file false tax returns in 1986, a year after the murder. Shapiro, shortly before his death, had been named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the tax case and was killed the day before he was ready to testify. We see that so often. Shapiro would not have been indicted himself, but he did have a lot of damaging information, which obviously provides the motive for his murder. What's odd about the case, including the fact that the key witness had been murdered in what police referred to as a mob style murder or mafia hit, is that Kessler and his co conspirators were only sentenced to probation and did not serve prison time for the charges, which were centered around helping Shapiro file false tax returns from 71 to 76. So Kessler, I want to make sure you all understand this. Kessler's the accountant that did the tax returns. Shapiro is the guy with having his tax returns done by Kessler. They end up being false tax returns. Kessler is convicted of helping him file his false tax returns, but only gets probation. Now, why, if you're Kessler, would you kill your client who you just helped get false tax returns for multiple years from 71 to 76 filed for? Because now he's going to be the unindicted co-conspirator to testify against you in what you were covering up and for who. And that's where it gets good. Why was Shapiro an unindicted co-conspirator if he was the one actually filing the fraudulent tax returns? Especially given that those who were charged with aiding Shapiro. Does that mean that he had planned to testify about other people involved? Also, why were those convicted given such lenient sentences? Despite the high profile murder of the key witness, most likely the motive for Shapiro's murder was to prevent him from testifying in this specific case because obviously it's going to be about a source of income that was not reported. Where did he get the income? And that's what becomes an interesting question. Kessler had previously come under suspicion after the murder of his business partner, Frank Wazenoff, Yassenoff. A lot of people dies around this guy, and his fiancee, Ella Rich, in 1970. But Kessler was never charged in their murder. Both Wasanoff and Rich had been found dead in Wasanoff's car in his driveway. 2 years later, in '72, Kessler was taken to court by the IRS for failing to provide records of an Ohio-based construction company called Brittany Builders, when Kessler was secretary and thus custodian of those records. Kessler was first ordered to provide those records, but that decision was later dismissed in '73. One of the lawyers defending Kessler was a guy by the name of Joseph Dillon of Detroit, Michigan. He also represented mafia people on tax evasion cases. A decade later, Dillon was also involved in an '86 case involving Kessler and Arthur Shapiro's filing of fraudulent tax returns. In '72, the records of Brittany Builders were wanted in connection with a tax liability investigation into Carl and Sandra Neufeld, Neufeld. The requested records ranged from the years '67 to '69. Brittany Builders had been incorporated in '67 by a guy by the name of Joseph Eisenberg, a Columbus area lawyer and a B'nai B'rith member, and was canceled as a company in 1970, the year of Yasinoff's death. Local media reports said that Yasinov having been the president of Brittany Builders. Wazanov's son, Solly, later told the newspaper that he knew for a fact his father had been involved in taking bribes and making bribes from public officials in connection with real estate deals of Brittany Builders. In '73, a Columbus police um, claimed that Yazanoff and Rich were killed during a robbery, a claim they had made at the time of their deaths. However, it was not made at the time of their death. It came later when police reported that the prime suspect in that robbery and their murders was Joseph Bogan. He had been killed by his partner, Rudolph Glenn. Police also stated that Bogan, Yazanoff, and Rich had all been killed with the same gun due to ballistic tests they had conducted. Yet the police claim that the gun in question was never recovered, even though they could have ostensibly obtained it from Glenn. Glenn was cleared of any wrongdoing in Bogan's death due to a self-defense plea, and the murders of Wasinoff and Rich were still classified as unsolved. So the whole thing falls apart. And just like with Seth Rich, it's robbery, but no robbery, and only after the fact. Sounds like they're trying to cover something up. Kessler was heavily involved in resolving issues related to Yazanov's estate after his death, with Arthur Shapiro also being heavily involved as he was the attorney who served as the executor of Wasanov's will. Kessler and a woman named Marjorie Dyer were the only witnesses who had signed Wasanov's will, and Kessler had also come under suspicion when Dyer died in a suspicious auto accident. Almost sounds like a Clinton story, doesn't it? Everybody around this Kessler guy dies. So Kessler, Shapiro, and Wasanoff had all been connected to a maze of business dealings. When police researchers were looking for files on the Wasanoff murder case during the investigation into Shapiro's murder, they were unable to locate them. So somebody inside the police department is helping cover up murders. The interconnected of Wasanoff, Shapiro, and Kessler and other aforementioned information suggests that members of the local law enforcement was part of the cover up in the deaths of Wasanoff, Rich Shapiro, and Marjorie Dyer. Whitney's question was, did Barry Kessler, an accountant, really wield enough influence in Ohio to avoid being heavily scrutinized for not just one, but several murders? And the chances of that would be 0. But who did? Who was rich enough that lived in Columbus, Ohio, that had that kind of pull? In the case of Shapiro's murder, more evidence comes out later. So in '96, Columbus Police Chief James Jackson was under investigation for corruption. Jackson was charged with improper disposal of public records for ordering the destructions of the reports of Shapiro's homicide. Hmm, wonder who would have paid him to do. In a report written by the Columbus Police Organized Crime Bureau, was sent to a commander of the Intelligence Bureau and was suppressed. And it was just ordered for it to be destroyed. So they investigate the investigators and for destroying stuff, and the report written for investigating the investigators, it's ordered destroyed, just trying to keep up. However, one copy of that report did not get destroyed. So, and Jackson ends up getting a 5-day suspension for the destruction of a public record. So this one copy was later obtained by an attorney, journalist, and executive director of the Columbus Institute for Contemporary Journalism. He accidentally sent this copy when he did a FOIA. Jackson responded to the fact that it existed. I thought I got rid of it, adding that the report was scandalous and that it made accusations against people that he found didn't warrant merit. So, the official title of the report was Shapiro Homicide Investigation, Analyst and Hypothesis. So, Whitney refers to him as the Shapiro murder file. The report most likely suppressed to protect two of Ohio's wealthiest men named Les Wexner and Edward DeBartolo Sr. The document does not mention Barry Kessler once. It does mention John W. or Jack Kessler, former Columbus City Council president and co-founder of the New Albany Company alongside Wexner. Wexner associate Jerry Hammond and former city council member Les Wright. Jack Kessler would go on to become a board member of Ba Bank One and later JP Morgan, where he played a key role in the hiring of the current Jamie Dimon. JP Morgan would also be the main bank Epstein used after the collapse of Bear Stearns. Nice little circle there. The documents noted that the law firm where Shapiro worked, called Schwartz, Shapiro, Kelm, and Warren at the time of the murder, but later became Schwartz, Kelm, Warren, and Rubenstein, was representing Wexner's company, The Limited. Arthur Shapiro, prior to the time of his contact, at the time of his death, managed the limited account. So he was Shapiro's business lawyer and got murdered for filing a during a court case for filing a fraudulent tax return. So was he taking kickbacks? It was let's see. So he dealt largely with a guy by the name of Robert Morosky, Morosky, who was the top man at the Limited after Wexner. That guy would leave in 1987, which is kinda in the middle of all of this, and had previously been referred to by New York Magazine as one of the real demons of American business. Stanley Swartz was a senior partner at Shapiro's law firm, took over the account after Shapiro's murder. Shortly after Shapiro was killed, Swartz incorporated a company, Samax, Samax Trading Corporation. It was controlled by Wexner with the express purpose of engaging in business liquidation. Wexner acquired 70% of Omni Oil, Omni Exploration, and was elected to its board of directors along with Schwartz that same year. So Schwartz, who's the law firm representing Wexner, is also in business with Wexner. Ohio state records show Schwartz incorporated the Samax Trading Corporation and Samax Trading Company within 1 month of each other in '87. Samax Trading Company did not adopt the same name, Samax, until '87. I was 87 twice, and had previously been called JAS Liquidations, Inc. Company records included a consent letter stating that the board of directors at Luex, another company controlled by Wexner, had given its consent that JAS to adopt Samax's trade name. It was JAS, not Samax, that was incorporated in '85, but the company does not appear to have been incorporated in Ohio, which is interesting, despite its address being listed as Columbus, Ohio. The company reincorporated in Ohio using, um it's possible that it could have been incorporated using something other than Samax 2 years after its initial creation. But what she's saying here is by specifically looking at how these companies came into being, there's a lot of inconsistencies. Like somebody's trying to create shell companies or disguise when things were originally created. So 1 month after JAS became Samax Trading Company and Samax Trading Corporation was also incorporated as an Ohio corporation by Stanley Swartz as a holding company for shares of Omni Oil. This setup was used by Swartz and Wexner since July 1985. The year JAS became Samax in '87, Swartz also incorporated the Wexner Investment Company. Harold Levin, Wexner's top money manager from '83 to '90, was its initial president, according to Shapiro's murder file. Levin was also listed as vice president of PFI Leasing, which shared the same phone number as Wexner's investment company. Again, all the same thing. PFI Leasing was incorporated by Levin in '83, the year he began managing Wexner's fortune. Records list that the new law firm, after Shapiro was killed, um, that in '86, Richard Rubenstein, the guy that was added after, he died, was given a speeding ticket while driving a vehicle registered to this PFI leasing company. The Wexner Investment Company at the time the Shapiro murder file was written in '91, also shared a different office with Omni Oil and Intercontinental Realty, which was incorporated the same year as Wexner's investment company, with the involvement of Dorothy Snow, who was an attorney at that same law firm. And interestingly enough, the Intercontinental Realty has the same name, Intercontinental, as Epstein's main company called Intercontinental Asset Group. And remember what we said about these naming traditions where you can find if you search on Intercontinental or Pegasus or unicorn or whatever it is, whatever that word is, these people love using that same name, just different variations of it for their front companies. So, at the time the Shapiro murder file was being written, the head of Wexner's investment company and Wexner's new money manager, Jeffrey Epstein, whose name is notably not mentioned anywhere in the Shapiro murder file, the year 1987, when many of these changes with Semax and the creation of the investment company took place, is the very year that Epstein began to serve as a financial advisor for Wexner. Levin was forced out of Wexner Investment Company in 90 after Epstein was put in charge. He was basically demoted, which prompted him to resign. Epstein must have significantly benefited from Wexner during this period to warrant such a rapid and dramatic promotion within 3 years of joining Wexner's companies. Once Epstein had taken over Wexner's top money manager, PFI Leasing was dissolved. Records of its dissolution list Wexner as the director and president of PFI Leasing and Epstein as the vice president. Levin had been delisted a few weeks prior. Both Cemex companies were similarly dissolved in 92 with the records, which makes the records of that disillusionment not publicly available. So, just before Epstein becomes involved in Wexner's inner circle in 86, John Kessler and Wexner co-founded New Albany Company. Mira Shapiro's murder file notes that Wexner Investment Company and PFI Leasing shared the same phone number, same address at the Huntington Center. Also, the address for John W. Wexler Company and the New Albany Company was all listed together. So basically, Kessler was working for Les Wexner, and Kessler is the guy that's going around killing people. So, this is a quote from one of the local articles in '93. Legend has it that in '86 or so, Jack and Les were cruising in Les's Land Rover near New Albany, about 12 miles from downtown Columbus, and they saw acre after acre of empty farmland, virgin soil, and thus the billionaire, getting a vision thing, declared that his buddy this to his buddy, "This will be my new home." Wexner and Kessler formed New Albany Company, that was the name of the suburb, spun off a bunch of paper corporations to cover their footprints, front companies. Indians knocked on doors, made offers so that no one knew it was Wes Lexer. Sounds like Walt Disney did down here in Central Florida. Under the Omni Oil, the Cemex companies, they kept set up all these companies as if different people were buying up all this farmland. They were suspected of being somehow connected to organized crime. All of these companies were suspected of being part of the murder of Arthur Shapiro. Because remember, Arthur Shapiro is representing Les Wexner while all of this stuff is going on. Epstein himself was involved in the New Albany company as well. He was the general partner in New Albany's real estate holding company called New Albany Property. And he put at least a few $1,000,000 into the project. Epstein's role in New Albany was significant. Before he came along in '88, the financial preparedness and groundwork for the New Albany development was a total mess. Epstein cleared it up because remember where Epstein was working was with that chick in New York in that very expensive $25,000 a month rent doing real estate. So Epstein would later obtain a 23-room mansion and estate at the New Albany development from Wexner in 1992. Not a bad investment. New Albany's success required several changes to the Columbus City policy and their zoning laws. As was alluded in the murder file, they were accomplished through questionable investments made by Wexner's controlled entity in a jazz club run by the former city council member, Jerry Hammond. His successor was less right on the city council. Wexner controlled entity in this case was called SNJC Holdings Inc. It also has the same address as the Huntington Center, so it's another front company. The murder file cites substantial evidence regarding how Hammond was mysteriously able to make payments on a luxury apartment despite not having any enough income for payments, suggesting a bribe was paid. Hammond also was swept up in an emotional debate about Wexler's luxury housing project and was accused local officials of selling out. A New Albany company managed to secure all the necessary policy changes. Some of this subsequent projects were later accused of acting in complete disregard for the existing state and city laws, but yet no action was taken by any of the officials. The murder file also says that the likely motive was related to the IRS investigation, stating that Shapiro was due to be in court for a grand jury the following day. So it states the subject is an individual who knew Shapiro and had some personal professional connection with him. B, would benefit from his death or from ensuring his silence. C, had close contact with La Costa Nostra, which is a mafia or organized crime figure because of the hit, and D, had the personal finance resources to afford a contract killing. Ha! Wonder who that could have been. Wexner and his associates involved in ordering and financing. Oh, so the murder file then makes a this is the controversial part and the reason why, morning, Bridget, thank you. Um, the reason why they tried to nix it is because after they collected all of the evidence, they made a hypothesis as to what likely happened. And the hypothesis was that Wexner and or associates ordered the hit. It discusses several transactions of questionable ethics, legalities involving Wexner, specifically Kessler, Wright, and Hammond, and involving Wexner himself, and states that author Shapiro could have answered too many of those sort of questions and might have been forced to answer them in the grand jury. Stanley Swartz, who was the senior partner in the law firm, might now be able to answer some of the same questions for the same reasons, but does not face a grand jury, is immersed in the pattern of questionable Lexner linked transactions himself, and now has a powerful incentive to maintain discretion. So that was the hypothesis. The important part of the murder file from the perspective of Whitney's book was discussions of Wexner's associations with organized crime, specifically the Genevieve's crime family and those associated with Edward D. Bartolo and Frank Walsh. Edward D. Bartolo Sr. was born in 1909, got his start working with his stepfather in construction business, Michael DePartolo Construction. In the 40s, he formed his own company and eventually became a real estate baron, primarily in suburban shopping mall complexes. So obviously, the guy with Max Fisher and Lex Wexner, who went around and built a whole bunch of and bought a whole bunch of shopping malls, would be in bed with Edward DeBartolo. So he also bought a Thistledown racetrack near Cleveland involved um, involving an Emprise corporation, which was indicted and convicted in '72 for racketeering and serving as a front company for organized crime. And I'm telling y'all, during this period of time, it may not be true today, during this period of time, from the early 20s, 30s, every book we've read has the mafia involved in horse racing. So, if anybody's involved in the ownership of the racetrack, the betting, just like a casino, it's mafia related. And this guy was, found guilty of racketeering. So, DePartolo's business empire was a, maze of different corporate entities that we have come to know as a way to disguise criminality. So they set up all these you don't have to have I mean, if you look at some of these companies that are large, what's the big, large construction company that does all the defense contracts? You don't need 50 companies, you need 1, and you do all your business out of there, if you're a legitimate company. As soon as you see them set up, like, 50 companies, and they start moving money around in these companies, they're not a legitimate company. DeBartolo appears in the Shapiro murder file listed as a Youngstown, Ohio-based real estate developer associated with Les Wexner. They didn't name him, but that's who it is. I had one of my very good friends, from Youngstown, and he used to joke about how much, uh, uh not good things happened in the government of Youngstown, and I thought that was funny. There's an Air Force Reserve base there, and I've been to that base, it's such a small area, but evidently there's a lot of crazy things that go on there. Um, the report says 2 men, quote, "have a well-known history of business and investment partnerships, and in the late '80s, twice attempted jointly to acquire Carter, Howley, Hale department stores," unquote. So, obviously, close, working partners. The file goes on to say that DeBartolo was an associate of the Genevieve's La Rocca crime family in Pittsburgh. Also, it seems that they used the Pennsylvania Crime Commission to get that piece of information. At the time of Shapiro's murder, the boss of the Genevieve crime family was Tony Salerno, and we paid mm, excuse me, we've come across his name as it relates to some of the Lucky Luciano, dealings, Tony Salerno. In 1981 report from the U.S. Customs Office, Special Agent William Berta asserted that DeBartolo's business empire was operating as a money laundering scheme, realizing huge profits from narcotics, guns, and skimming operations, and other organized crime-related activities through Florida-based banks in which DeBartolo had a controlling interest. So this looks like everything that we've seen as far as the, uh, Gladio networks. DeBartolo organization, specifically the parts of his empire based in Florida, had reported ties to Carlos Marcello, Santos Trafficani, and Meyer Lansky. Became because its enormous wealth and power has high-ranking political influence and affiliation. So he's part of the mob. Meyer Lansky, the same report says Meyer Lansky, the financial wizard of organized crime, is now considered by most to be almost senile, and that his financial wizard successor was going to be Edward DeBartolo. DeBartolo had ties to criminal activity, was also in other documents. Florida Department of Law Enforcement stated that WFC Corporation is a cover for large narcotic operations in the world. Further states that the organization under federal and Florida state investigation in the late 70s was heavily influenced by Santos Trafficani, and we covered it extensively when we did chapter 7. Florida authorities were investigating loans made by WFC Corporation from its Grand Cayman Islands subsidiary through Metropolitan Bank and Trust Company in Tampa, where the majority stockholder is Edward D. Bartolo. So that basically is that Metropolitan Bank and Trust was his money laundering bank. They all have them. D. Bartolo had bought Metropolitan Bank in '75. He forced the bank president to resign in '81, with other board members having no say at all. The bank then collapsed a year later, which bank leadership attributed to bad real estate loans. Y The pattern just happens over and over and over again. They buy the bank, they steal all of the money, loan their $9 for every one, an uncollateralized loan, the bank fails, and now they got all this much all a whole bunch more money. In the late '70s, an FBI wiretap of Los Angeles-based mobster Jimmy Fradiano, Fratianno, picked up him and DiPartolo with, um, Arnold Carabia, the mob boss of DiBartolo's hometown of Youngstown, Ohio. So, Wexner's relationship with DiBartolo, who, as we just went over, is intimately involved in mob activity, puts him right next to mobsters. And that's very important as we go through the rest of this book, and that's why I wanted to go back and I wanted to spend some time on, um, those relationships so that you understand when you talk about Les Wexner, you can't, not associate everything he did with intelligence agencies and mobsters, which directly ties him, as with DeBartolo, to Operation Gladio, because the whole drug running, money laundering aspect, in many cases, are tentacles of Operation Gladio. They're all intricately, knitted together. DeBartolo was one of Ohio's richest men in his lifetime, and just like Wexner, lived his life above the law. Investigations and charges were dismissed right and left. It didn't seem like anything that he could do, um, ever stuck to him. So his son and heir, Edward DePartolo Jr., who was pardoned by Donald Trump right before the former president left office. And that is a very interesting footnote, which I have not researched, but I find very interesting. Wonder what he got in exchange for his pardon. So, Shapiro's murder file also had a Francis J. Frank Walsh, who also has ties to the Genevieve crime family. Walsh was the owner and CEO of Walsh Trucking Company out of New Jersey. Walsh Trucking Company was the primary transporter for the Limited in Columbus, Ohio. And we know logistically how important trucks are to the whole um, Teamster uh, mafia hold on Teamsters and their unionization of truck drivers, how all of that ties into the distribution of illegal substances. So, all notices during the investigation of a New York organized crime task force was addressed to Frank Walsh Financial Resources. And guess what address? Frank Walsh, who has a trucking company in New Jersey, has an entity called Frank Walsh Financial Resources with the same address as Limited in Columbus, Ohio, with Les Wexner. That's how close these people are. So, Frank Walsh was charged in 1988 by the DA, Samuel Alito. Yes, that Samuel Alito, Supreme Court justice, with paying thousands to officers of a corrupt Teamsters union, as well as members of the Genevieve crime family in exchange for a sweetheart union contract. This corroborates the claim in the Shapiro murder file that Walsh had ties to the Genevieve crime family. So screw the truckers. I'm going to get me a sweetheart deal. Unions have never been there for their people ever. Most unions started out in Chicago as communist entities owned by the International Syndicate. We found that out in Anthony Sutton's books. Just saying. Per the Alito case, quote, illustrated how certain seemingly legitimate businesses are able to get a jump on their competitors by entering into an agreement with organized crime. And it illustrates how organized crime is able to get enormous profits by entering into an agreement with seemingly legitimate businesses. Tony Salerno, the Genevieve crime boss, was listed as an unindicted co conspirator in these cases. Walsh was arrested at his home and, according to his attorney, had somehow become a real estate developer worth about 60 to $100 million while Walsh Trucking, among other companies that he had, was forced into bankruptcy by an antitrust suit. Walsh pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 4 years in prison in 1990. Walsh was again accused of corruption in 2003 when a Teamster union filed internal charges against a member of their executive board, Donato DeSanti. DeSanti was accused of helping Walsh, whom he knew to be a convicted labor racketeer with ties to organized crime, manipulate officers of the local Teamsters union and cooperating with a scheme DeSanti knew or should have known was questionable legality. The union charged DeSanti while hiding Walsh's past conviction and the Organized Crime Association from union members. So, also, according to the murder file, Um, these connections present authors Shapiro's 1985 murder in a completely different light than what it was conventionally reported. While Barry Kessler may well have played a role in author Shapiro's death, it seems unlikely that he had the political pull to cover up the police involvement and cover up in not one, but three connected murders of Frank Yazanoff, Arthur Shapiro, and his fiancée, Ella Rich. nor did he have the financial resources to pay for a professional hit. But he definitely needed to be taken out of the way, and that's why he was later arrested and sent to prison for whatever his involvement was. So, what led Columbus police investigators to produce a document like the murder file in the first place? Its subsequent suppression and attempted destruction suggests scrutiny aimed squarely at Les Wexner was too close for comfort for those in law enforcement trying to protect him. They were um, more interested in protecting their I'm gonna use the word big boss than they were in solving a murder, which was their job. And then, of course, there's accusations later on of all of the police in, Columbus had moonlighting gigs as Wexner's, um, bodyguards and security at all his big events on his compound after it got built with all of the waivers he got from the city. It just like with any, um, local government that has big time billionaires in a relatively small community, that big time billionaire, if they're unscrupulous, can buy the entire entity and have their thumb on everything. So, the next chapter how long have we been at this? We're almost 2 months. See, I'm not even gonna get to the next chapter. This stuff is so good and so timely with what's going on. So let me try to get through. I'm gonna hold y'all just a little bit longer today because I want to get through meeting Epstein with Wexner and how that happened. Because when we start getting all the revelations of Epstein, it's weird how we started this book a few weeks ago, and then we know that all of the stuff on Epstein's going to come out, and I want y'all prepared so you understand the depth of all of the information and the names of people. I want you to know who these people are. So we're going to do this last section and then we'll get to the next chapter next time. All right. So Leslie Wexner's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein um, has kind of been nebulously explained in media and not very well documented. So years after the pair officially parted ways during Epstein's first arrest and subsequent imprisonment in not in, let's see, in 2019, the New York Times reported that from the very beginning, Wexner's friends and colleagues were mystified as to why a renowned businessman, Wexner, glommed on to Jeffrey Epstein. They basically referred to him as an outsider, but he was not an outsider. Supposedly, he was introduced to Wexner in '85 by a well-connected insurance executive by the name of Robert Meister, who was a close friend of Wexner's. Meister was the executive at Aon AON Insurance. And let's see, he made the introduction, and he became the vice chairman of Alexander and Alexander, the second largest insurance brokerage company in the world. So this is a big guy. Since around 1958, A&A had been a major provider of consulting services to W.R. Grace. And we talked about Peter Grace. He's the son of W.R. Grace. A&A was awarded a $250 million insurance brokerage contract by the government of Kuwait in the early 90s. Huh, right around the 1990 is when supposedly Iraq invaded Kuwait. I might have to go look at that. Hold on, let me make a note here. Um, so A&A is awarded a contract by Kuwait to find marine and war risk insurance for $500 million worth of cargo to be shipped from all over the world as part of an international relief effort. The relief effort involved Americares and the CIA-linked Southern Air Transport. So, basically, Kuwait's getting in bed with, um, the CIA, and let me look here. Hold on just one second. Um, and potential child trafficking because that's what Americare does. Um, Cutling's part of their, mission. Meister joined A&A at a time when it was particularly troubled. The company's troubles in '85 was largely related to an acquisition of Alexander Howden, Howden Group. Soon after it was acquired, revealed that it was missing $50 million in assets that apparently had been embezzled and diverted to corporations based in Panama and like Liechtenstein. And this is Operation Gladio money laundering. Panama, Liechtenstein, those organizations, those countries have banks that were used exclusively, not exclusively, um, as part of the Operation Gladio money laundering. Could Meister have met Epstein through Epstein's purported job as a financial bounty hunter? Because remember when we first started talking about Epstein, there's a period of time where nobody knows what he was actually doing, and he had sold himself to all of these countries, which would have brought him into connection with BCCI, Castle Bank, all of the money laundering. Because remember, Robert Maxwell was selling Promise hardware, which identified money laundering through a back door that Mossad, who Robert Maxwell worked for, could track the missing funds. So let me rephrase this because this is very important that we understand what's going on. The Promise software had was stolen by the US government. The Department of Justice gave a copy to the CIA and they gave a copy to Mossad. That software was a backdoor created to it. So both the CIA and Mossad could track money laundering as well as basically all bank activity. So they could spy on the whole world in banking if the bank had the Promise software installed on it. So the the period of Epstein's career of him being a bounty hunter for missing money is basically meaning that he was for hire to track down money laundering for whatever entity wanted to go after it. And here's what I envision happening. In the in the case of Mossad, because all of these people are part of the um, Jewish network. I'm going to use those for this particular entity. Robert Maxwell was the salesman of Promise software to the world on behalf of the Israeli government and Mossad for their money laundering tracking, and not in a good way because they too were money laundering and it was a way for them to hide their money laundering. But also, if you know who's money laundering, could you not approach that person and say, "Hey, I know you just stashed $50 million over here. I want my cut. I'm going to blackmail you. If you don't give me my cut, you're not keeping your 50 million you just money laundered." Is that the kind of bounty hunting, Epstein was doing on behalf of Mossad and potentially the CIA, going around the world using Promise software to extort people. Um, didn't we just hear oh, yeah, Jack Smith. Wasn't that exactly what he was doing? So, you see how important this is, and with Operation Gladio and the CIA knowing all of the banks to use for money laundering, it kind of all goes hand in hand. So, I just wanted to stop for a second and explain to y'all how important what they just said, was in relation to Epstein's background in bounty hunting stolen money or money laundering on behalf and his partnership with Ghislaine Maxwell, whose dad sold the software. According to, um, Meister, this insurance guy, Epstein had struck up a conversation with him on a commercial flight to Palm Beach. Being impressed with the young banker, at the time Meister had met Epstein, he had already left Bear Stearns and was bounty hunting, which is more than likely where an insurance guy is going to meet Epstein, not on an airplane. Hello, insurance. Meister claims that Epstein invited him to play racquetball and began turning up in steam rooms at Meister's gym while he was there. Epstein offered his financial bounty hunting skills to help recover funds that Meister's insurance company that he had just bought had the $50 million missing. I don't think that's how that happened, but whatever. Meister is the only person to have made the claim about those events. So Meister supposedly is on vacation and he introduces Epstein and Wexner at Wexner's house in Colorado. Wexner subsequently claims in a statement after Epstein's 2019 arrest that he had only ever hired Epstein because friends of his, presumably Meister, had recommended him as a financial professional. If this is true, it further suggests Meister, perhaps at ANA's behest, had employed Epstein as a bounty hunter service. Meister has stated, because how else would he know he's good at it? Meister has stated his relationship with Epstein ended not long after he had made the introduction between the two men. In 1990, roughly 5 years later, he introduces Wexner to and Epstein. It was Meister's wife, Wendy, who introduced Wexner to Abigail Koppel, a corporate lawyer at the London office and powerful white shoe firm Davis Polk, now called Davis Polk in Woodwell. So Abigail Koppel is Les Wexner's wife now. Abigail's father was a major figure in the Haganah who opened the first American office of El Al Airlines. We already talked about it being a front for Mossad. Davis Polk was representing Wexner's company, The Limited. The Meisters were still connected to Wexner to make this introduction. So Epstein was also involved with aspects of Wexner's relationship with Abigail, having reportedly arranged their prenuptial agreement and attendance. He was in attendance at their 93 wedding. Wexner shortly after, Epstein and him starts hanging out, Wexner begins dyeing his hair, hiring a live-in personal trainer, began dressing differently, and basically, was going for an overhaul of his appearance. He also took on new interests. according to one of his former bodyguards who had been in charge of his security for over decades, not long after Wexner hired Epstein as his financial advisor, quote, Wexner had started collecting guns, but Les didn't know which end of the gun worked, unquote. Wexner would invite Epstein to shoot targets with him while he had all of these professional people around him who offered to help him, but Wexner didn't want them to do anything for him. He just wanted Epstein to do it. Um, so Whitney says this may have been because there's intelligence linked arm dealers that have privately disclosed these connections to Wexner, given that Epstein is reported to have known all of these weapons dealers. So maybe Wexner thought his being involved in international weapons dealing was a little bit better than the local cop giving him shooting lessons. Epstein's connections to arms dealing and Israeli intelligence may have impressed Wexner just as much as his talents for financial maneuvers. Epstein's introduction to Wexner came not long after the suspected murder of Arthur Shapiro. Epstein's connections to certain circles, along with his financial talents, could have been very attractive to someone like Leslie Wexner if and the timing is very interesting because if you have a scare, like one of your not one, your attorney getting, whacked for, uh, not you wanting to silence your attorney and him not testify, you may seek out someone with international ties to intelligence and all kinds of other things to be very close to you in the immediate aftermath, which is what she's trying to suggest here. In '87, Epstein was formally a financial advisor to Wexner. He helped arrange Wexner's fortune and offered advice into the finances of his business, the foundation that he created, Wexner Foundation. He even got involved in the design of Wexner's yacht called the Limitless. Wexner's apparent fascination with Epstein alienated a whole bunch of people in his circle, one of which was the vice chairman of Limited called Robert Morosky. Even Wexner's mother, Bella, um, got ticked off. They had kind of a really weird relationship, him and his mother, and she was very, um, not a fan of Epstein's. We'll just leave it at that. Um, it doesn't appear because she was like co-everything, co-part of the Limited, co-part of the foundation, um, and she basically got sick, and Epstein replaced her at the foundation, um, and they end up separating the foundations. She's just totally pissed off about it, um, and he basically starts using Epstein for everything that he had in the past used his mother for. So, Epstein is given a power of attorney, so that he can engage in all activities without Wexner's knowledge, and so it's impossible after that power of attorney to know what was done by Epstein and what was done by Wexner because Epstein could do everything. Efforts were made to have the logistics of the Limited intimately connected to not one, but 2 CIA-linked airlines in the '80s, airlines that was used in the '80s as a part of, Iran-Contra, and that was done after Epstein comes on board there. So, I believe, later on, we're going to see the connection. You remember we talked about the China lobby and the, flying tigers, and, Chenault moving that air operation into Rickenbacker, which is in Ohio, how that whole CIA front company is going to be part of this, discussion upcoming, but, that's basically what they're talking about. So, in addition to the logistics, Epstein became increasingly enmeshed in the real estate part. Wexner's acquisition and redecorating of the now infamous Manhattan Town Hall that Epstein would inhabit townhouse, sorry, that Epstein would live in, and, that's that same, so Wexner is the one that initially bought it and then put as much money into renovating as he basically did to buy it, and that's where Jeffrey Epstein's New York townhouse is. So it's hard to imagine without all of the surveillance and camera footage and everything else, being installed, how you would spend as much money on the renovation of that townhouse as you did on the actual purchase of it. But if you're putting top-notch surveillance and it's basically a Mossad front or, blackmail or CIA front for blackmail, whichever you want to, um, it could easily run in that kind of money. So anyway, we know what happens there. They end up, running a child sex, uh, trafficking network out of it, so given that, you can imagine that that's the deal. So, anyway, that's where we're gonna wrap up. We will start chapter 14, on our next, podcast. I pinned both, schedules to both the, X or Twitter and to True Social, and we're gonna maintain that schedule if something has to get canceled. Um I'll let you know that, and, otherwise, we're gonna try to stick to that schedule so we can get this done at the same time the height of the whole release of Jeffrey Epstein is back in the news again, so that y'all can spread the word and post about what the real deal is about the information that we're gonna see come out. Because as you can see with, this book, the depth of how far the tentacles go down to organized crime, Operation Gladio, the, banks and how they use them, the drug network. Jeffrey Epstein was not just a human trafficker. He was not just a pedophile. He was intricately involved in the entire operation, arms dealing, money laundering. And we need to make sure that everybody knows that. So that's what we're going to continue to uncover throughout the rest of this book. So I will see you next time. Thanks for being here. Please follow us and also give us a thumbs up because the more you do that, the higher in the scale we come when people search on stuff on Rumble. And I really appreciate you being here, taking time out of New Year's. Happy New Year's, everybody. We're gonna kick butt this year. Um, I'm excited about what's coming down the pike. It's gonna get off to a big bang. So, again, thanks for being here.